the fall of Adam, the reason for the Lord's coming, the ascetics. This, then, is the nature of that most renowned fall of our forefather Adam. He rejected the spiritual nourishment and pleasure and lowered himself to the pleasures of the bodily senses, according to virtually the entire tradition of the Holy Fathers. From this original fall of Adam, we too have inherited that primordial drive toward the material. This is why Theodore of Jerusalem wrote, "Adam, by using the senses wrongly, marveled at the physical beauty, and considered the fruit to be beautiful to the sight and good for eating. By tasting of this fruit, he gave up the enjoyment of spiritual things. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it." According to St. Maximus, that tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the passionate perception of the visible creation. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the visible creation, for participation in it produces naturally both pleasure and suffering. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is also the sense of the body, in which the activity of irrationality clearly abides, and which man has experienced. Although man received the divine commandment, he was in practice unable to keep it. This is also confirmed by Nicodemus the Hagiorite and others. St. John Damascene especially wrote, "The tree of the knowledge of good and evil can be understood as the visible and pleasurable food which appears to be sweet, but which in reality brings the partaker to a union with evil. For God said, 'You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die.' Naturally, physical food requires continual replenishment, for it is subject to corruption. He then, who partakes of physical food, finds it problematic to attain incorruptibility. For as soon as the senses know and experience the good, that is, sensible pleasure, they also necessarily experience evil, for the sister of pleasure is suffering. This is why, in general, all the sensible pleasures are customarily called painful pleasures." In connection with this subject, St. John Chrysostom wrote, "What is easier than eating? And yet I hear many saying that even eating is a wearisome toil." In agreement with the above, St. Gregory of Nyssa also wrote, "In the fruit of the forbidden tree there are two opposite elements commingled. God said that those who partake of it will die, just as one does, who suffers the evil effects of poison that has been mixed with honey. By the same token, as far as the pleasing of senses is concerned, it seems good, but as far as the destruction of the partaker is concerned, it is the ultimate evil." For this same reason, we have read in the history of the Romans that they worshipped two deities, joy and sorrow, at one and the same time. Even though they had dedicated to each a separate temple, they used to offer sacrifice simultaneously to both. This way, they indicated enigmatically how very close joy and sorrow are united, just as pleasure and suffering are. When one deity gives joy, the other creates fear, and when one harms and grieves us, the other gives us hope. From this point of view, the reason for the coming of the new Adam, Jesus Christ, can be said to be our liberation from seeking and loving only the visible things, and at the same time our exaltation to love and enjoy the spiritual realities, thus indicating our true transference to what is indeed better. Those who wanted to achieve this very goal with ease, that is, the cutting off of worldly pleasures and the enjoyment of the spiritual ones, were the true philosophers and ascetics who abandoned the inhabited places where there are always so many causes for sinful attacks and went to live in deserts and caves. Not finding there the usual causes of worldly pleasures, they were more readily able to subdue the senses, and in relatively short periods of time were able to rise up to the sweetest enjoyment of the spiritual and divine realities. the natural and unnatural pleasure of the mind. I beseech you to do this very same thing. You have come to know precisely on your own, being prudent and through Holy Scripture, that the natural pleasure of the mind is to always be preoccupied with and nourished by the beauty of spiritual realities. St. Maximus wrote, "Intelligible things are food for the mind." You have also come to know that the tendency of the mind toward the pleasures of sensible things is contrary to the nature of the mind. It is a tendency that is forced, passionate, corruptive, and entirely foreign to the mind. St. Isaac wrote that when the mind is attracted by the physical things, it partakes of the nourishment of the beasts and becomes, so to speak, beastly. According to St. Callistos, only the spiritual pleasure can be properly called pleasure, and be primarily pleasure, because during the course of enjoying it, and after the enjoyment, it still brings us joy. On the contrary, the sensible pleasure according to the flesh cannot be properly called, nor in fact be a pleasure. Physical pleasure uses the name of pleasure falsely, for in the enjoyment of it, and afterwards, it brings sorrow to the heart. Again, St. Callistos wrote, "This is what should properly be called pleasure, namely that which by nature and reason cannot be condemned, and which lasts and is ever more active, bringing joy and gladness to the heart even after it is fulfilled. Anyone, therefore, who would desire, let him seek the pure pleasure that is not mixed with sorrow, the intelligible and spiritual pleasure. For this is indeed the true and main pleasure of the heart. Carnal pleasure, that is not of the mind, and the spirit is even wrongly called a pleasure, for it is induced, and as soon as it is done, it creates a bitter regret. It is clearly a lie to call it a pleasure, for it is a spurious and counterfeit pleasure." St. John Chrysostom wrote, "The pleasures are harsh executioners of the body. In fact, they are worse than that, for they strain and force the body with bonds not made by hand." It seems to me, too, that pleasure is like a rough file smeared with oil, which when the cat licks it up, it also licks with it the blood of its own tongue. Or it is like a fly in the honey that tastes a certain sweetness, but is at the same time entrapped in the honey and dies. Pleasure is also a bait that is superficially sweet, but when swallowed, brings about a painful death. This is why the wise Solomon wrote, "The lips of an adulteress drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end she is bitter as gall." For a long period of time now, your senses have become accustomed to charge after physical pleasure. They have been drawing with them your mind, not permitting it to be nourished by thoughts that are natural, proper, and related to it. You have not been able to enjoy the appropriate spiritual growth in life and pleasure. What must you do? I have reminded you, by what I have so far written, that it is necessary to seek, as much as possible, to govern with great prudence your 5 senses. To those which are essential, that is, those which sustain the body, give them what they need. Those which are not essential, but only create pleasure, must be cut off. In this will, you prove yourself to be lord of your passions, when you will be able through your entire courage to liberate your senses from the corruptive, painful, and false pleasures, and when at the same time you will liberate your hegemonious mind from their distracting attempts, leaving it thus free to return to the desirable beauty of intelligible things, which are really and truly good. According to St. Basil the Great, it is truly inappropriate for man to allow the senses to be filled with sensible things, and at the same time to block the mind from its own proper activity among the intelligible things. He wrote, "I consider it inappropriate to allow the senses unhindered to be filled with their own matter, while the mind alone is shut out of its own proper activity. For as the sense is to physical things, so is the mind to intelligible things. Our senses then have, in a way, become hooked to the physical pleasures, not only during the early years of our youthful life, as we have indicated thus far, but also during the later years. Our own mind, and that of the entire human race, has also been hooked upon the bait of the same physical pleasures. Consequently, we have been shamefully deprived, and have all lost that blessed and true pleasure of ours. By the same token, if these senses of ours are not freed from the physical pleasures, the mind itself will not be able to be freed from them, and to return to its natural pleasure. It is impossible for this to happen in any other way. It is indeed impossible.